My name is Jay Brennan Shaw. I'm a professor at Central State University, and this is a brief lecture about plot structure, thinking about how stories are put together and what words we use to describe the different parts of a story. Let's start with something super basic. Two words we use a lot, often interchangeably. For the purposes of thinking about plot, though, it's helpful to make a distinction between plot and story. Now, there is the usage of story as in a short story, but here we're thinking of story. You might think of story the way we say we tell a story. A story is simply everything that happens in a fictional text, all the different events. Plot is a word we use to describe the causal structure, which demonstrates connections between events in a narrative. Causal meaning we see how different parts cause each part to cause the next part. So if we contrast these, a plot is looking at how does point A lead to point B, which leads to point C. So we might not need to talk about certain parts of the story that aren't related to the plot, things that have to do with establishing character, setting, things that are more about demonstrating the author's ability at craft. Story, then, we might have the example here: the king died, the queen was sad. Two events that happen. Plot is the causal structure between those. The queen was sad because the king died. One event leads to another. So hopefully this distinction is helpful as we start to think about plot structure. Plot at its center is often about conflict, which we might describe as the incompatibility between the desires and goals of two or more characters or elements in a story. Now remember, protagonist is usually the central character in the story, and their desires motivate the plot. They're often working against an antagonist, which might be a person, it might be nature, it might be their own actions. That's the conflict. It's incompatible. When we talk about the movement of a story, we often use the term plot device to describe an event that occurs in the story, and it seems to only be in the story to move the story forward. So you might think about in a film when it seems as if out of nowhere something is inserted simply to move things along. Suddenly someone has a new power. Suddenly someone has access to information, and there's no narrative connection. The contrasting thing would be narrative technique, an event that moves the story forward that flows naturally from the ongoing development of characters within the world of the story. So instead of a character suddenly getting a new power, we're talking about a superhero story. Naturally, we've seen throughout the story that they've been developing more powers, and they've just developed this power, and it's not out of nowhere, it makes sense. That is what we call narrative technique. The central thing we're going to think about when we think about plot is plot structure. So often we envision a plot looking somewhat like a pyramid. And this is a cartoonist rendering of what we call Freytag's pyramid, which was originally named and described by Gustav Freytag in 1863. So if we think about the plot in this way, we think about starting sort of flat, escalating action, rising to the climax, falling action, and then the denouement. So we'll go through each of these different terms, but what's important to think about overall is that this is one classic way that we can plot a plot. Now, there are other ways to map out plot. Um, the writer Kurt Vonnegut has several other ways you can think about this. Other cultures have different ways, but classically in Western literature, this is how we've thought about the structure of plot. So exposition is that first part. You'll notice if you look back at the pyramid that it's flat. This is where we get the development of the background of the characters and setting. So exposition is just sort of placing us in the world, introducing us to the main characters, introducing us to the setting where things are going to happen. It's really just table setting. Rising action is when events start to occur that start to build towards the climax. The climax is the highest point of intensity. It's the turning point for the protagonist, which changes her fate. So if you think about it as rising and falling action, the rising action is leading to the point at which all the pressure has built up. Everything is leading to this moment. Maybe it's the final showdown, maybe it's the final confrontation. The climax is where everything changes. After that is the falling action. The conflict unravels as things move towards the final fate. So, what is the aftermath of the fight, the conflict, the sort of, if it's maybe an internal sort of conflict, this is maybe the point at which the protagonist asks for help or realizes they have a problem, and the falling action is them then coming to terms with that problem. And the denouement is the events following the falling action till the end of the story. This is where the conflict is resolved and there's a new version of the world. So if the conflict changes everything for the protagonist, the falling action is them coming to grips with what that means. And the denouement is what is the new world of the story going to look like? So again, all 5 of these are parts of this pyramid. Now, not every story maps exactly onto this, but generally a story is going to lead to a climax and then fall after that climax. Generally, a story will establish characters at the beginning, and by the end, you'll have a sense of what the new normal is for those characters. Inside this story, a couple other terms to think about, some of which we might know from film. The first is flashback. We see these often in film, but they happen in written fiction as well. A flashback is a scene which takes the reader back in time to a point before the current story. This might fill in information we need to know. It might give us a sense of stakes, but it's telling us something about the past, and then we return to the present moment of the story. A flash forward is the sort of opposite, a scene which takes the reader ahead to a time to reveal events in the future. The story then returns to the present of the narrative. So if a flash forward happens, if we move forward in time rapidly and we never come back to where we were previously, that's simply a forward jump in time. A flash forward is often used to give us a sense of something that's coming. It might tell us, oh, look, the reader will know that in the future this is resolved. We don't know how. We have to go back to the present narrative to figure it out with the characters. Or it might be used for foreshadowing of something bad that's coming. So we flash forward, we see that things are very different in the future, but we don't yet know how we're going to get there. So we return to the present of the story, we're going to figure it out. A third term that's helpful thinking about moving around in time and narrative structure is a frame narrative. This is a story that introduces another story. So think of this as a story within the story. There's an initial story that introduces or establishes a context inside a second, more central story will be placed. Okay, that's a little confusing. So we might think about, for example, Wuthering Heights, if you've read that novel. In that novel, the story of Heathcliff and Cathy is being told by servants and other people that experienced it. So initially, we meet those characters. The sort of frame narrative is those characters telling a writer about this. But the central story is the story of Heathcliff and Cathy. To get there, we have to get through this frame narrative. It sort of goes around the narrative. So these are just a couple terms that might be helpful for thinking about plot structure and plot elements. There are certainly more terms that you could investigate yourself, but this will give you a good way of being able to look at a story and think about how is this structured? What is the story? What is the plot? And what are the key elements of that plot?